At the end of December 2007, Kenya went to the polls in what was supposed to be just another election. It turned into one of the darkest chapters in the country's history. The vote was close and messy. President Kibaki was running for re-election against his main rival, Raila Odinga. When the results came in, they showed Odinga ahead for most of the count, but in the final hours the numbers shifted, and Kibaki was declared the winner. He was sworn in almost immediately, in a quiet, hurried ceremony at State House. Odinga and his supporters cried foul. They said the vote had been stolen. Within hours, Kenya was burning. What followed over the next 2 months was not just political anger. It became ethnic violence, sharp and brutal, tearing through towns and villages that had lived side by side for generations. Machetes, bows and arrows, clubs, and burning tires became the tools of the moment. Families who had been neighbors for decades turned against each other. Churches, homes, and shops were set alight. In one of the most horrifying moments of the crisis, dozens of people, mostly women and children, died when a church in Kiambaa, near Eldoret, was set on fire while they were sheltering inside. By the time the violence calmed down, more than 1,000 people were dead. Estimates from human rights groups and later investigations put the number at over 1,100. Some say closer to 1,500. More than 600,000 people were forced to flee their homes. Entire communities became refugees in their own country, crowded into camps, sleeping under plastic sheets, waiting for a peace that took months to arrive. Eventually, under intense pressure from African and international mediators, led by former UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan, Kibaki and Odinga agreed to share power. Kibaki stayed as president, and Odinga became prime minister in a new coalition government. The immediate crisis was over, but the deeper question remained unanswered. Who was responsible for the killings, and would anyone ever be held to account? Kenya set up a commission to investigate what had happened. It was led by a respected judge, Justice Philip Waki, and it became known simply as the Waki Commission. For months, the commission gathered evidence, took statements, and pieced together how ordinary political rivalry had exploded into organized violence. Its final report was damning. It concluded that the violence had not simply erupted on its own. In several regions, it appeared planned and coordinated and, in some cases, funded, with meetings held in advance, fighters mobilized, and lists of targets drawn up along ethnic lines. Justice Waki did not release his full list of suspects to the public. Instead, he did something that would change the course of Kenyan history. He sealed the names of those he believed bore the greatest responsibility inside an envelope and handed it to Kofi Annan with strict instructions. If Kenya failed to set up a credible local tribunal to try the suspects within a set period, Annan was to hand the envelope over to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Kenya's parliament had its chance. A bill to create a special local tribunal was put to a vote. It failed, blocked by a mix of politicians who, depending on who you ask, either did not trust local courts to be fair or simply did not want to be tried at all. Interestingly, both William Ruto and Uhuru Kenyatta, men who would later find themselves in the ICC's crosshairs, voted in favor of the local tribunal bill at the time. It did not matter. The bill failed anyway, and with no functioning local mechanism in place, Annan kept his word. In July 2009, he handed the sealed envelope to the ICC's chief prosecutor, an Argentine lawyer named Luis Moreno-Ocampo. Ocampo opened an investigation into Kenya's post-election violence soon after, using powers the ICC rarely uses. He sought and received permission from the court's judges to open a case on his own initiative, without a referral from Kenya's government or the United Nations Security Council. It was one of the first times in the court's history that a prosecutor had done this. For more than a year, investigators combed through evidence, interviewed witnesses, and studied patterns of violence across the country. Then, on the 15th of December 2010, Ocampo stood before reporters and announced the names the world had been waiting for. 6 Kenyans, he said, bore the greatest responsibility for the bloodshed. The press quickly gave them a name that would stick for years, the Ocampo Six. The 6 were split into 2 separate cases. One case named Deputy Prime Minister Uhuru Kenyatta, the head of the civil service Francis Muthora, and former police chief Hussein Ali, all seen as linked to the government side. The other case named William Ruto, fellow politician Henry Koskei, and radio broadcaster Joshua Arap Sang, all seen as linked to the opposition side. It was, in a strange way, a mirror of the conflict itself. 2 sides, accused together, each blamed for driving violence against the other. William Ruto, at the time serving as a cabinet minister, had gone from a rising political star to a man facing the possibility of a trial at the world's highest criminal court. The question that followed him for years afterward was simple but heavy. What exactly had he done to end up on that list? Some of the worst bloodshed happened in the Rift Valley, particularly around Eldoret, Ruto's own political base. This region has a long, painful history of land disputes between different communities, tensions that stretch back to the colonial era and have flared up around nearly every election since Kenya became multi-party in the 1990s. Ocampo's prosecutors argued that the 2007 to 2008 violence in this region was not random anger boiling over. They said it had a structure. According to the prosecution, a network had been built well before the election results were even announced, ready to spring into action if the vote did not go the way certain leaders wanted. Ruto, they claimed, was one of the central figures behind this network. The formal charges brought against him were serious: murder, forcible transfer of population, and persecution, all classified as crimes against humanity. Prosecutors alleged that Ruto had helped plan and organize attacks against communities seen as supporters of the rival PNU party, that meetings had taken place where strategy was discussed, that young men had been recruited and, in some accounts, paid or promised rewards, and that the goal was to drive certain ethnic groups out of parts of the Rift Valley through fear and force. Joshua Arap Sang, the radio presenter, was accused of playing his own part by allegedly using his platform on Cass FM, a station broadcasting in the Kalenjin language, to help mobilize people and coordinate action, though he always denied this was anything more than normal broadcasting. Henry Koskei, a senior party official, was accused of helping plan and finance the operation. All three denied every charge from the very beginning, and they kept denying them all the way to the end. Ruto in particular was consistent and forceful in his denials, calling the accusations political persecution dressed up as international justice, and arguing that he was being punished for being on the losing side of an internal power struggle within his own political camp, rather than for anything he had actually done during the violence. The case moved slowly, as ICC cases tend to do. In September 2011, the suspects traveled to The Hague for hearings. In January 2012, judges decided there was enough evidence to confirm charges against Ruto and Sang, sending their case toward a full trial, though the charges against Koskei were dropped at this stage for lack of sufficient evidence. It looked, at that point, like Ruto really would stand trial. Then Kenyan politics did something almost nobody had predicted. In the 2013 election, Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto, men from opposing sides of the very violence they were now accused of orchestrating against each other, joined forces. They ran on the same ticket, Kenyatta for president and Ruto for deputy president, in what became known as a political alliance built partly on shared legal jeopardy. They won. Kenya now had a president and deputy president both facing crimes against humanity charges at the same court, at the same time. It was a situation without precedent anywhere in the world. Running the country while also flying back and forth to The Hague for hearings created enormous strain, both political and practical. But the trial itself was where things truly began to unravel, not because judges found Ruto innocent, but because the prosecution's case slowly disintegrated from the inside. One by one, witnesses who had originally agreed to testify began withdrawing. Some said they were too afraid to continue. Others simply vanished, refusing to answer further contact from the court. Several witnesses later admitted, under questioning, that they had lied in their original statements or had been coached on what to say. The prosecution accused unnamed parties of witness intimidation and interference, even bringing separate charges against individuals suspected of bribing or threatening witnesses to stay silent, though those side cases largely went nowhere as well. By 2016, the ICC prosecutor at the time, Fatou Bensouda, who had taken over from Ocampo, was forced to admit that the case against Ruto and Sang could no longer proceed as planned. There simply was not enough reliable evidence left standing. On the 5th of April, 2016, the judges terminated the case. Crucially, they did not declare Ruto innocent in the way an acquittal after a full trial would. Instead, they ruled the case void due to what they described as a troubling number of witnesses being interfered with or refusing to cooperate, without formally clearing Ruto's name through a verdict on the facts. It was a legal grey zone that satisfied almost no one entirely, not those who believed Ruto was guilty, and not fully those who wanted a clean, unambiguous declaration of innocence either. By this point, every single member of the original Ocampo Six had escaped a verdict. Kenyatta's case had already been withdrawn in 2014, also citing insufficient evidence and witness problems. Muthora's case had been dropped even earlier, in 2013. Hussein Ali and Henry Koskei never even made it to the trial stage. What started as 6 of Kenya's most powerful figures facing crimes against humanity charges eventually became known, almost bitterly, as the Ocampo Six, turning into what commentators called the Ocampo Zero. For Ruto, the collapse of the case did not erase the years it had shadowed him. He went on to serve 2 terms as deputy president alongside Kenyatta before the two men had a dramatic falling out ahead of the 2022 election. Ruto ran for the presidency himself that year, campaigning as an outsider standing up against Kenya's old political dynasties, and won. The man once summoned to face judges in The Hague was now taking the oath of office as Kenya's head of state.